Food security forecasts project that the COVID-19 pandemic will have caused the most severe global food security crisis in recent history, both nationally, with potentially upwards of 16% of the population becoming food insecure, and globally, with 270 million pushed into acute food insecurity in 2020 alone. Caitlin Welsh, director of the Global Food Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, in Washington, D.C., writes in a recent essay, quote, how the Biden administration responds to each will affect food security and the U.S. reputation as a global leader for decades to come. And this is what we'll cover in conversation here with Ms. Welsh as she reviews impacts to domestic and foreign food security in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, offers updates where both stand in 2021, and addresses why she calls for the Biden administration to not approach these challenges as either or, but to understand how the US's ability to lead globally hinges on our ability to address challenges at home. Hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society Digital Programming. I'm Ben Speggen and I'm the Vice President at the Jefferson and I'm a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. Joining me in conversation is Ms. Caitlin Welsh, and she's here to discuss food insecurity crises at home and abroad, why Biden must lead on both. The title of her essay, the very title of that essay for CSIS. Now, no stranger to the JES digital programming stage, Caitlin joined us in April and in July of 2020. So we'll take a look back to then to discuss what's changed, what's still changing, and explore what lies ahead. Now, as the director of the Global Food Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Caitlin provides insights and policy solutions to global food security challenges. She brings over a decade of U.S. government experience to this role. She served most recently in the National Security Council and the National Economic Council as Director of Global Economic Engagement, where she coordinated U.S. policy at the G7 and G20 across multiple summits. Prior to the White House, Ms. Welsh spent over 7 years in the Department of State's Office of Global Food Security, including as acting director, offering guidance to the Secretary of State on global food security and its relationship to urbanization, climate change, and conflict. As a presidential management fellow, she oversaw a portfolio of agricultural-related grants at the U.S. African Development Foundation. She's lived and worked in Morocco's breadbasket region as a Peace Corps volunteer, witnessing the complex causes and effects of food insecurity and working to improve lives through education. She received her bachelor's degree from the University of Virginia and a master's degree from Columbia University School of International Public Affairs. And she speaks both Arabic and French, and she hails from Erie, Pennsylvania. Now, folks, since this program is first airing live on the JES Facebook page, we're going to work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you have a question, just leave it in the comment section below. If you're watching or listening to a later broadcast of this event, still send us your questions, your comments to remain engaged and keep this conversation going. And for more information about both upcoming JES programs as well as past events, you can stream on demand and a wide range of publications available free to download. Visit jeserie.org and be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Ms. Caitlin Welsh, thank you for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you for having me, Ben.
So, Caitlin, I want to get right to your piece, but that piece, the same title as our program today, Food Insecurity, Crises at Home and Abroad, Why Biden Must Lead on Both. But, can I start in congratulating you on the anniversary of starting your work with CSIS? You've been there a year now in this post.
Thank you. Exactly. I started a year ago today, which I like to tell people is also the same day as the mandatory telework started with my workplace. So I actually haven't worked from the building. I've worked only remotely.
So you've been working remotely during the entire pandemic. You've been covering it. You've plugged in twice to update us on food security. So let's take a look back. When we were discussing food security in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic in April, Caitlin, I can't help but think of the focus we were placing on the vacant shelves we were seeing at that point, the scarcity of food, the disruption of the supply chain, stores with bare shelves all around, and also the debate over wiping down our groceries before we were putting them on our own shelves once we had secured those. Certainly things have changed, but take us back to April. Tell us what it's been like to be working to address the pandemic then and there, and some of the progress that's had to been made from there to then, some guidance models, information. So what did we have at hand then? And then we can get into what we're looking at now.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I'll take it back actually to last March when I first started. Again, day one of lockdown. I knew from having studied food security during the Ebola pandemic in West Africa in 2014, that there would be food security related impacts of the pandemic. And I also knew when I started with CSIS that I hadn't seen anything in the media, at least to that point, that gave advice on food and food security as it related to COVID-19. And so one of the first things that we did when I started with CSIS was to put out a really comprehensive Q&A about everything having to do with food security in our country and around the world, all the questions that we could think to ask, all the questions that we thought our readers would have. And I just reviewed those questions, Ben, as you and I talked about, and it was really shocking to remember where we were a year ago. Some of the questions were about how long should I stock my pantry for? We were heeding advice that we should stock our pantries for 2 weeks at a time because we simply didn't know what supply shocks would be coming. As you just mentioned, we didn't know if it would be possible to contract COVID-19 from foods, from packaging, et cetera. There was a lot that we didn't know at the time. Thankfully, we just needed time and experience to get answers to those questions, but thankfully we're in a different place right now.
I can remember those conversations and asking those. What was that dialogue like in the first days with folks turning to CSIS as a resource, asking those kinds of questions, needing those answers in the now, very much in the real time of I'm headed to the grocery store. What are you trying to advise me of? How much I need to stock up? What I need to do with my groceries once I return home? What was it like to have that conversation in the early days back in March and April?
Yeah, well, I mean, I could just say it was unlike anything I had experienced before, because while I had worked on food security policy for about 10 years leading up to that point, I had never seen so much attention to food security in the media, particularly by the US media, particularly having to do with food security within our own country. And that continued for several months. It's not only what I was working on every day, but after work, I'd turn on the nightly news, and it was making headlines every night. So that was the first time I'd ever seen that. And we were getting questions from domestic press and foreign press about food security around the world and in the United States. So getting hit from all sides.
And I want to turn to that in a second to talk about food insecurity in the media and our focus on that. But you had mentioned your work on the Ebola outbreak and being able to draw from that. What did we learn there that was applicable here? How were we learning in real time to develop new models to really build our scientific knowledge around, quite frankly, a virus we didn't know much about at the early onset? So how did you draw from what you did know, what was comparable, and then build out a model to move forward?
Yeah, that's a good question. I wouldn't say there's any direct parallels, except for the fact that I knew that food security would be affected. So, for example, what we were seeing in West Africa in 2014 was that people who were, well, now that I think about this, we did see some parallels. People who were employed in agriculture and food systems were themselves falling sick, and so you had lower levels of production. I'm thinking of West Africa, where we actually did see that at times in the United States. We saw that markets had to close, for certain periods of time. We saw that when people's food security was diminished, then their bodies were less able to fight off sickness and to keep them well. So I knew that the very specific ways we would be affected would be different, but I did know that there would be food security impacts, and I thought with my platform, we're in a perfect position to be able to articulate those and help people anticipate them.
And a friendly reminder for anybody joining the conversation now, that platform is CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where you are the director of the Global Food Security Program. Caitlin, you had just mentioned that, we were seeing a lot of headlines, being grabbed by food and food security in the early months. And that stayed with us as we were unpacking the pandemic, its impact on our life and what we were learning. But we're seeing that get a little bit less real estate when it comes to coverage these days. Is that because we've solved the food security crisis, or are we just less attentive to it now?
Yeah, I think that one of the reasons that this topic was getting so much attention at the very beginning of the pandemic. Now, again, the ways that food security was being affected were ones that most of us had not experienced in our lifetime. But at the very outset, I think that there was a fear in the media and among the population in general that our food supply would be drastically cut, that our access to food would be cut off. And I think that speaks to a very real fear that, that humankind has had for as long as we've been around. And so I think that that's a lot of the reason you were seeing the headlines at the outset of the pandemic. There were disruptions in food supply chains and in food systems, certainly in the first few months of the pandemic. By and large, those have stabilized. But to your point, Ben, that doesn't mean that people are more food secure. The reasons that people are food insecure in our country don't necessarily have to do with food supply disruptions or lack of disruptions. They have to do with other things. People remain food secure. They remain far more food secure than they had been, food insecure than they had been before the pandemic. And that is making headlines, but you're right, not as frequently as it was about a year ago.
And the statistics I used in the intro, that was drawn from your piece, that, globally, we're looking at 270 million being pushed into acute food insecurity. When we use the word acute there, for us that aren't dealing with this on a day-to-day basis, what sort of measurement is that? What are we looking at when we say, acute food insecurity? And when we hear the number 270 million, put that in context for us, please.
Sure. Well, about a year ago, the UN World Food Program predicted that the number of people experiencing acute food insecurity around the world would increase by 80% to 270 million people. And I can actually say that we just published a piece about 2 hours ago from an affiliate of our program who works for World Food Program USA, announcing that the World Food Program Executive Director recently stated that actually we've surpassed that number, unfortunately. So actually at this point in time, 272 million people around the world are facing acute food insecurity. And what that means is simply that people can't access enough calories to meet their basic needs. That has nothing to do with the quality of those calories, with the nutritional quality of the calories. It simply means that people can't access enough of even a basic staple food to meet their caloric needs.
And here in the United States, 16% of the population is food insecure. If we're looking at a trend line, where is that compared to where we had been, and where does it look like we're going if we don't get into solving this right now?
Yeah, so that number, you're going to see a lot of different numbers in the media. The number that I used was probably based on the latest data that I had, which came from the Census Bureau, actually. And that's those numbers have been fluctuating throughout the pandemic. We can get to this a little bit later, I think, but one really excellent resource we've had throughout the duration of the pandemic, actually starting last April, has been a survey that the U.S. Census Bureau has implemented. They were doing this every week. Now they're doing it every 2 weeks, asking Americans a host of questions having to do with not just food security, but education, employment, et cetera. And they make the results of this data available to the public. So that's what we're looking at. And we've seen a few peaks in food insecurity. One last summer, again, around the holidays. It's declining at this point. I can say, once we get the annual figures for 2020, now we're not going to have those annual figures for several more months now, unfortunately. Once we have those annual figures, I'm expecting them to be at least the highest, at least since the Great Recession, perhaps the highest levels of food insecurity this entire century.
So that's alarming and jarring. But I think I take a glimmer of hope out of that to say that, we're anticipating that the trend is declining. We're seeing fewer people be food insecure here in the States. And I wonder if, I see an uptick in commercials and campaigns pushing for donations to, a cause, using them as an example, Feeding America, as a cause. And we see the call to support local food banks. Are we, or can we, food bank our way out of this problem?
So to your first point, yes, those lines they're falling. It's not to say that we might not have another spike, but I think that they're decreasing not because of donations to food banks, but they're decreasing because we're seeing slow improvements in the economy, and because we will see improvements because of provisions in the American Rescue Plan that was just passed by Congress. But to your point, can we food bank our way out of this problem? I've been very pleased to see all of the attention that food security is getting in our own country during the pandemic. Again, nightly news and other news sources are featuring this regularly. I think for a variety of reasons, most of the attention and funding will go to, to Feeding America and to food banks, which is incredibly important at this time. In fact, I even donate to Second Harvest Food Bank in Northwest Pennsylvania for that exact reason. But it's also important to know that food banks and food pantries, as we say, they're the safety net below the safety net. And no one who operates a food bank or a food pantry thinks that those should be the long-term solution to food insecurity in our country. I think that everybody involved in this cause acknowledges that there are a variety of other longer-term solutions that make a lot more sense. One government program that we can talk about a little bit, our modern food stamp program, SNAP and WIC. That's one thing that people who operate food banks and food pantries continually remind the public is that dollars go much farther through SNAP and WIC, and just it's much more long-lasting impact. So it's a very important that we're very lucky to have our food bank and food pantry system, but it's not a long-term solution.
Right, and that's what I think of these as the stopgap measure between someone finding them in themselves in hardship or their family in hardship for a moment in time, not the duration of their life. And I think you capture it well in your essay to say that this is an income problem, and we'll get to that in a minute. But you had mentioned the American Rescue Plan, and I want to get to that. But I think to get to that part, let's take a look at what had preceded it and talk about some of the work of the Trump administration before we look at the Biden administration. So major challenges that the Trump administration had faced when it came to food security during 2020. What stood out to you that they had to address? And then we'll talk about the notable successes that they had during that time.
So I mean, we saw food insecurity spiking, at the outset of the pandemic. There's been a lot of recognition, though, that the U.S. government expanded our safety net system, SNAP and WIC, quickly, and that did a considerable amount to quell food insecurity and to keep even more people from falling into food insecurity. So I think that's one good thing that happened through the course of 2020. Not to say that it hadn't been the intention of the Trump administration to limit access to SNAP and WIC. There was a case that went to federal courts that was actually what the Trump administration was trying to do was struck down. But overall, Congress did increase the amount of funding available through SNAP and WIC.
And two different important things that we do see during the Trump administration was the CARES Act and the CAA. Those two acts as relief efforts to the country. What did addressing food security look like at that moment? Because I want to then turn to the American Rescue Plan and take a look at what's in there now and how we're continuing to address this. So what did we see in CARES and in the act that followed that?
Yeah, certainly. I can speak to CARES Act actually. So in the CARES Act, we had $8.8 billion for child nutrition programs, $15.8 billion for SNAP, and then $450 million for food banks and other community programs. So it was a considerable amount of funding, and that was given, its due recognition.
And so turning now to the American Rescue Plan, what do we see? What do we see there? Put that in context and follow up to the CARES Act. Do we see greater funding, less funding, different funding being deployed in different methods? What do we see now under the Biden administration?
Yeah, certainly. So one thing I think is pretty excellent is that it extended the 15% increase in SNAP benefits through September 30th of this year. But more than that, one thing that I think is pretty interesting, it was a critique of the funding that was increased under the Trump administration, was that while more funding was given for SNAP and WIC programs, there was not more funding for the administration of those programs. So it had a lot more money available, but not more staff to help enroll people and help distribute benefits. American Rescue Plan does do that. So it also includes funding for administration of these programs, which I think is incredibly important. And then lastly, it provides more funding for online purchasing options for SNAP and WIC. So at this point, 48 states have in place pilot programs to allow people who benefit from SNAP and WIC to use those benefits online. And it's a variety of online outlets ranging from massive nationwide outlets to local and regional ones. So I think that's a really excellent program, especially during a pandemic when you're trying to limit your exposure to other people.
I was just going to say that because I remember one of the things we talked about, and I think you actually talked about this in the interview with Jim Wirtz for the Erie Reader, talking about, going to a grocery store, and, the challenge is that many of us, that's a social experience. We go there to chat up
Hmm.
the people we know who are there, who are workers, and then thinking about the barriers now being put in place. And so being able to remove a barrier now where people would be able to purchase online, out of that convenience. I think that's a huge step in the right direction of keeping people safe, because this is, after all, a public health crisis first, and that has economic implications. But until we can resume pre-pandemic behavior, we need to find ways to stop the spread of the virus.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there were points within the last year. I recall looking at this, and I think that it was about 20 states had pilot programs going. So a number of states that are allowing their residents to use their benefits online, it has expanded rapidly, which I think is that's excellent.
So I was just talking about the economics of this, and this being an income problem, and I drew a paraphrase from a quote. Now I want to read the quote from the piece, your piece: "Food insecurity, crises at home and abroad, why Biden must lead on both," for CSIS, available on their website, out just a few months ago. You write, "Our food insecurity problem is an income problem, not a food problem." We've touched on it already, but I think that that's such an important line that, Caitlin, I want to ask you to unpack that it's not a food problem, it's an income problem.
Yeah, thanks. I think that I probably take this for granted a lot, but that Americans understand this. But I think that there's still a misperception that people are food insecure in our country because there's not enough food available. That's not that's absolutely not the case right now. No one is food insecure because we don't have enough food right now in our country. In fact, when you look at the latest data on agricultural production put out by USDA, they're predicting that at this point, production of all grains by our country is it's little bit below 2019 levels, but greater than 2020. So like pretty steady production of grains. Production of all types of meats is we're going to have record production of all types of meats at this point. So we had disruptions in supply chains, but we did not have a decrease in the amount of food that would lead people to be food insecure. On the contrary, people are food insecure simply because they don't have the income to access healthy food. That's by and large the greatest reason that people are food insecure in our country. And then on top of that, it's that people have too easy access to unhealthy foods. And so I'm seeing a lot of discussion now about, and I agree with this, about food swamps, not food deserts. So it's not about not having access to food at all. It's about having access to food that's unhealthy. But back to my point about food insecurity being an income problem, not a food problem. Pleased to say that this isn't something that President Biden understands. I heard him say within the past couple of months that this might have even been on inauguration night, that food insecurity won't be solved until people's income increases. But he made comments along to this effect. And I know this is an issue he's followed for decades, so I'm very pleased that he understands that fundamentally.
And I want to get to that in a second, but what you brought up, that term food swamps, I think is important to keep in mind, because I think of a research project done by the JES Civic Leadership Academy that looked at creating a community poverty index to measure the cost and weight of poverty, and that looked at availability to food in looking at, while there may be access to food, is it fresh produce, and if it is it $1 per banana or apple at a checkout line, instead of a grocery market where you might be paying a poundage, or a cheaper rate for that. But then also the availability of, well, there is food there, but how nutritionally rich is that if it's a processed box of something? I don't want to call anything out specifically, but
Yeah.
thinking of the quality of food that we have access to, and then creating that, to say that's what people need to be lifted out of food insecurity, is the means to be able to purchase that and the means to have access to that. Another quote I want to draw from your piece, because we talked about it earlier, and already we're seeing that 270 million number that we talked about up to 272. That is an over 80% increase from 2019. You write, If these forecasts bear out, the coronavirus pandemic will have caused the most severe global food security crisis in recent history, deeper than the global food price crisis of 2007, 2008, and accompanied by the worst levels of domestic food insecurity in decades. How the Biden administration responds to each will affect food security and the US reputation as a global leader for decades to come. And I want to get to that in a second to unpack that part. But have we seen in our history, take us back through our history, have we seen a president face a food insecurity challenge like this before or this deep before?
Yeah, I'll go back at just as far as this century. The worst global food security crisis happened in 2007, 2008. For a variety of reasons. It was there were supply shocks around the world, and then a number of coinciding events and political decisions that drove the price of staple foods up to such a level that tens of millions of people, of additional people, were thrown into food insecurity. That was in 2007, 2008, around the time of the Great Recession. That happened around the world. The United States didn't see food prices rise within our own borders in the same way that they did around the world. So we were dealing with an economic crisis at home, but we weren't dealing with the same food security crisis at home as we were seeing abroad. And we were able to mobilize a very effective response to food insecurity around the world at that time. We have predictions by, the prediction by the UN World Food Program, we're now seeing results. So we're seeing that. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization also makes predictions, and they put out some of the most important numbers, the most important assessments of food insecurity around the world. Those are going to come out this summer. So we're waiting on 2020 data for global food security to come out this summer. We're also waiting for this fall for the 2020 numbers to come out in the US. Unfortunately, when it comes to big data sets, it takes a long time to put those together. So we have to wait, further into this year until we see those final numbers for sure. But I am expecting that we will see record levels of food insecurity in the United States, and that the predictions about food insecurity around the world will bear out. So as far as I'm seeing, we will see a coinciding of the worst numbers of global food insecure people in the United States and around the world at the same time.
And like other crises, the pandemic hasn't begotten this. It's in a way augmented it, but it certainly shined a light on it. That now we are paying attention to it because perhaps we see it more pronounced because of our current status. In your essay, you write that the U.S. government has long tolerated unnecessarily high levels of food insecurity within its borders. Over the past 20 years, the proportion of people living in food insecure households has rarely fallen below 10%. What's led to that toleration? That to me is an alarming number, that we've never gotten below 10%. What has led us to that toleration when it comes to food insecurity within our own borders?
Yeah, I don't know. I'd be interested in talking to someone with years more experience in this than I have. I don't know. It predates the two of us, I think, but I can say that there were times in the United States that food insecurity here was seen as a national security concern. So, for example, going back to World War II, Congress established the National School Lunch Program around the time of World War II, after observing that many recruits for World War II had been rejected because they weren't properly, they were malnourished. And at that time, Congress established the school feeding program, National School Lunch Program, and this is a quote in the actual act, as a measure of national security to safeguard the health and well-being of our nation's children. So certainly there have been times that we've acknowledged this as a national priority, and then there are times that food security within our own borders just falls prey to polarized politics.
And I see that as a great example of leading us through that crisis and out of it at that time. And so I'm curious what you're calling for, what you see, or what you might recommend that the Biden administration start to do differently now to get us through, leading both nationally and internationally.
So let's see, nationally, I think that we're on the right track. I think that the provisions in the American Rescue Plan are ones that make eminent sense, and I think that they're rightly being applauded by advocacy organizations. But I also think that every effort to improve the economy right now will ultimately improve food security among American families, American children, American individuals generally. So I think that those we're doing the right things. When it comes to, we, at a minimum, I hope that we come to pre-pandemic levels of food insecurity, but then ultimately to bring us to zero, as you mentioned in the essay that I wrote. I really think it has to do with the two things that I mentioned, which have to do with making sure people have enough income to purchase food. That's pretty basic, and then making sure that they have access to healthy foods. There are a lot of other things that come into play. I think that time poverty, for example, is really important, because if you're living in poverty, you might be working multiple jobs and you have very little time to be focusing on your nutrition. So there are other factors that come into play, but to me, those are the two basic ones.
In time poverty, we think of people running from one job to the next and not having the time to, go home and perhaps prepare a more nutritionally rich meal, where they're opting for something that is more convenient, but less nutrient dense and rich, and overall not a higher quality food, but it's convenient because they have to get to the next place to then buy the convenient but perhaps unhealthy meal. You make the case this is not an either or. This is, we need to address this nationally, and we need to also address it abroad. Before asking, what that looks like, and diving a little bit in there, how do you anticipate the Biden administration guiding that conversation after having succeeded in administration that championed an America First nationalistic policy? How do we resume our international role? How do we talk to Americans about the importance of doing that internationally?
Yeah. So this is, turning to global food security. I think that there's probably a perception out there that that all of our global programming came to a halt, for example, during the Trump administration, and that wasn't the case when it came to food security. It wasn't the case when it came to most other foreign policy and global development priorities. So, for example, while the Trump administration proposed in its budget to drastically cut or zero out a lot of our bilateral and multilateral food security funding, Congress ultimately appropriated funding through bilateral and multilateral means. So it was actually in the last administration that the United States nearly doubled its contribution to the World Food Program. So it's not like the United States was asleep at the wheel. We were still active participants when it came to global food security programming. So we're not starting from zero. I think, though, that that it will be important to start to articulate the importance of these things again to the American public, and to start to message these.
And I think that's a challenge sometimes for Americans, is having a conversation around foreign policy, and being able to dive in and talk about that, communicating the benefits. Because as an example, I often think of, you and I have talked about this before, droughts in Central America. And if we're not sending foreign aid to curb that, we then might be dealing with that issue in another way, which might be climate change refugees seeking refuge in our borders because we didn't send aid to address a crisis they were experiencing in the moment. How do we have that conversation with Americans to know that this isn't a zero-sum experience where we're just funneling money out and not seeing anything back in return, that there is something to be gained from the US playing a role on the international stage?
Yeah. I think that you just touched on part of it, which is the willingness of the American public to participate in these conversations. But I think that the onus falls on the US government to communicate to the American public the value of our investments abroad, but also to communicate that we're not investing abroad unless it benefits Americans all over the country. I mean, that's why we're making investments in the first place. And I think that in the past few administrations, we've failed when it came to that communication, unfortunately. And I see, with regard to some of the Biden administration's policies, that there is greater attention to communication. For example, we saw the first primetime address late last week. And then you see that this week, the administration, that they're hitting the road to communicate that plan to the American public. I really hope to see that happening with programs and policies beyond the American Rescue Plan, because I think that the average American deserves more information about the benefits to them of foreign policy, foreign investments, et cetera.
Caitlin, earlier you mentioned the budget, the U.S. budget to foreign aid. Put that in context for us of how much of our overall budget is dedicated to foreign aid. How much are we spending on addressing food insecurity internationally?
Yeah, so I don't have the latest figures for what our total budget is for, for foreign assistance, and it also depends how you define that. But I can say that when surveys are done of the American population, the population always overestimates the amount of our budget, the fraction of our budget that goes to foreign assistance. And Secretary Kerry, when he first came to office, whatever the title was, like let's say the American public thought that they might have thought that the foreign assistance budget was 1%. He's like, I wish it was 1%. It's not even 1%, or something along those lines. Whatever it is, the American public continually thinks that a greater fraction of the budget goes for foreign assistance than it actually does. When it comes to food security assistance, just a couple of numbers to compare. I saw a $15 billion plus up to SNAP and WIC in the American Rescue Plan. That's $15 billion. Just as a plus up in our most recent in this most recent bill. Last year, the United States gave a fifth of that. Well, a little over a fifth of that, 3.6 billion, to the entire World Food Program to address acute food insecurity in every country that's experiencing crisis levels of food insecurity around the world. So we're certainly spending magnitudes of money more on food insecurity within our own borders than we are around the world.
And I think we've heard the phrase before, explain foreign policy for the middle class. Is it working that way to explain it to Americans of this is what we're actually looking at in terms of investments and how we're actually all benefiting from those investments?
Yeah, I think that there's been some important work done on those in that regard, but as I understand, the messaging on that might be shifting a bit to be a foreign policy for all Americans, because it's not just middle class Americans for whom we want our foreign policy to work, but those who with lower incomes than middle class. So I think that as Secretary Blinken said on the occasion of President Biden's first foreign policy speech at the State Department, he said foreign policy is domestic policy and domestic policy is foreign policy. So everything that we're doing abroad should ultimately strengthen us at home, and only through unity and strength at home can we have a strong foreign policy. So I'm really pleased to see that they're making that connection.
And I think that shows the complexity of the issue we're dealing with, and how challenging that can be. Caitlin, I want to go to the comment section from the Facebook page because we have a question from an audience member taking a look at, in particular, some of the aid that's going to be deployed. They're thinking about red line districts, places that are food deserts. Earlier, you mentioned food swamps. I think that's a phrase we need to think of more. This person's asking domestically, there are many areas, especially in red line neighborhoods, that suffer from food deserts. Are there any federal programs that provide grant funding to help establish food stores or co-ops in those underserved areas?
That's a great question. I don't know the exact answer to that question. Happy to, to follow up. I will say though that I think that speaks to a perception again in the public that people are food insecure because they don't have access to food. It's not just food deserts. There's an excellent book out recently that talks about how food swamps. Well, actually, yeah, it's food swamps that have a much higher correlation to obesity rates among low-income Americans than food deserts. So I think you're going to be seeing a lot more attention to food swamps. Not that food deserts are not problematic, because they are, but I think that simply perpetuates the idea that if you build it, they will come, and that's just not the solution.
And that's something that you, I think, articulate well in this piece, which I would encourage people to head over to the CSIS website and read. It's by the same title of the program that we titled here today, Food Insecurity Crises at Home and Abroad, Why Biden Must Lead on Both. You really do hammer home that this is an economic issue, not necessarily a direct access to the amount of food issue. It's not that there's a scarcity of food, it's that this is an income problem. And I think that you highlight that well. Why aren't we getting that yet? Because it doesn't strike me that that's a new look at this problem, that it's been an income problem for a while. What challenges are we having perceiving that and understanding that it's an income problem, not a scarcity of food problem when we're looking at this nationally?
Yeah, really quickly, I want to say back to the to food deserts. I think that if you think about it, well, again, a lot of people have this perception that if you build a nice grocery store in a low income area, people will automatically be more food secure. But really what people need is greater income to purchase food there. They need transportation to those grocery stores. They need time to prepare healthy food, et cetera. So again, this if you build it, they will come notion is it simply doesn't play out in reality. Not that it's not important to increase access, but just wanted to make that comment. When it comes to this notion, Ben, that you just said about people just not getting it, that that income is a real challenge. That's something that afflicts the global food security community as much as it afflicts the food security community domestically. I think people simply assume that if you have more food, then people will be more food secure, and that's why around the world, a lot of our investments have to do with increasing agricultural production. When what we're seeing because of COVID is that people are food insecure around the world. Those numbers are increasing, the numbers we talked about, because people are losing jobs, they're losing incomes, they're losing remittances. It's just something that I think it's a hard learned lesson among the food security community. I also think that it takes much more complicated solutions. I think that it's not as simple as just making more food for people. And I think that that's, in essence, that's probably what both communities are avoiding is a very complicated solution.
Well, and I think you gave us a great example that while great, if we introduce a grocer into an area that had not had one or had not had quality food before, that's one step, but it's not the only step. It's creating the transportation modes to ensure people can get there. It's making sure that people can afford the grocery store that's being placed in their neighborhood. So I think it shows that complexity of that. And I think that's part of the great work that you're doing at CSIS. And I want to turn a moment just to say you've been doing great programming, you've been doing great reports. Talk to us about that level of engagement, what you've done, because now a year in, again, congratulations and happy anniversary. A year into being director of the Global Food Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Tell us about some of the initiatives you introduced over the year and continue to build over the year to communicate this to people so that we do better understand these complex issues.
Sure. Thank you. Let me think about this. Lots of media engagement to get the word out about the level of food insecurity and what some possible solutions are. Proud to have put out some products that explain the role of racial inequalities to food insecurity in our country. That was quite obvious, and it was getting attention during the protests last summer. That doesn't mean that racial inequalities are not continuing to exacerbate food insecurity among certain groups. What we're continually seeing throughout the pandemic is that on average, African American households are experiencing over twice the rate of food insecurity as white households. So I really try to weave that into all the work that we're doing, is to continue to bring attention to that topic. We were able to debut some really excellent mini documentaries that were actually started before my time, but we debuted them this summer that talked about climate impacts on food security in a number of countries around the world. So certainly proud of that. And I'm very excited to be starting pretty soon some work on food insecurity among military families and U.S. veterans within our own country. So excited about that. And last thing I'll say is that right now is a perfect time to be reassessing our approaches to food insecurity around the world. And so we put out an entire series of essays by some very prominent thinkers and practitioners when it comes to food security, including a Nobel Peace Prize winner, a World Food Prize winner, a number of academics, about how our approach to food security should be changing around the world. And that's a series called Reset the Table that we put out this fall.
Thank you for that, Caitlin. And final question here before we wrap up. And looking in light of the piece you've written, food insecurity crises at home and abroad, why Biden must lead on both. The call that this is not an either or, choosing one or the other, highlighting the complexity of this issue, it being an income problem, not a food availability problem. In this moment, as we're looking at where we are right now in time, as someone working on policy for food security, part one, what keeps you up at night? Part two, what gives you the most hope?
Great questions. Two things keep me up at night. One is the increasing incidence of diet-related non-communicable diseases in our country, like hypertension, diabetes, obesity. rates of obesity in our country have tripled since the 1960s. And that's something that it's continually disconcerting. Secretary Vilsack, the Secretary of the Department of Agriculture, has said recently that the United States spends more to treat diabetes each year than the entire budget of USDA. So that is a wicked problem. So that certainly concerns me. And then also the lifelong impacts of food insecurity among Americans, not only on them as individuals, but on education levels in our country, on economic growth in our country. So it's not just that we have, it's not just that the effects last for this week or this month. It's that these play out over lifetimes for individuals and for and for our country. But the one thing that's giving me hope is something that I'm really excited about, is the monthly benefit for families with children that was just incorporated into the American Rescue Plan. So that's that families with children will receive up to $300 per month per child. With some institutions estimating that with that benefit, we'll see reductions in child poverty by up to 45% among Black families, more than 50%. So anything that happens to reduce poverty in our country will also go a long way to increase food security. So I'm thrilled that that was passed. I'm glad that it's receiving as much attention as it is. And I really look forward to seeing how food security improves because of it.
Just to hear it again, nearly half and then over half in addressing that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
That's huge. And so that does give us hope. Caitlin Welsh, I can't wait to invite you back again. I hope you'll come back and give us an update on food security, taking a look nationally and internationally. This is a great piece. I'd call everybody to head over to the CSIS website to read it. Same title as this very program, folks. Food Insecurity Crises at Home and Abroad, Why Biden Must Lead on Both. Very thoughtful, insightful. Something you should pay attention to. I hope you do. But Ms. Caitlin Welsh, Director of the Global Food Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, in Washington, D.C., a proud Erie native. Thank you for taking the time, energy, and effort to join us and share your insight and knowledge with us here at the JES Digital Programming stage.
Thank you so much, Ben. Always enjoy it and look forward to joining you again.
Excellent. And folks, of course, thank you, the viewers, for tuning into this, whether you're watching in real time live on the JES Facebook page, or you're catching this, streaming it on demand from our website, jeserie.org. We can't have these programs without you, these conversations without you. So thank you for being a part of this. Caitlin, for folks looking to connect with you and to follow the work you are doing at CSIS, where do we point them?
To our program website. So you can just Google CSIS Global Food Security, and then you can follow us on Twitter. It's at CSIS Food.
Excellent. And folks, for more information on both past and upcoming JES programming, as well as publications, a wide range from reports and essays to timely discussions and topics, do visit jeserie.org. And be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Speggen. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us.